Today, we're talking about Theresa May and what she should do next. Welcome to Reaction. I'm the editor of Reaction, Ian Martin, struggling with hay fever today, so apologies for any sniffles along the way. And I'm joined by my colleague, Tim Montgomery. So, Tim, this was inspired by a piece written by Andrew Jimson on Conservative Home, a profile of Theresa May, the former Prime Minister. And you have an interesting take on what she should do, because she's in a really interesting position. She's in the House a lot, gets quite a lot of publicity, still commands attention. What do you think she should do with it?
The first thing I should say, Ian, is good luck with the hay fever. I know you're really struggling with it at the moment, as lots of people are. And the other thing I should say is that I think Theresa May ignored all of the public advice I gave her when she was Prime Minister. So I offer this advice more for fun and in hope than in expectation. But some viewers of this video will know Ian Duncan Smith is not only a close friend of mine, but I was Chief of Staff for his last 2 months of his leadership. Brought him down quite quickly after I joined his office.
It wasn't your fault.
but I was part of what I hope was his rehabilitation in politics. And so it's partly a little bit of advice from experience of having been there. And I've always liked Theresa May, and she was instrumental and helpful in setting up the Centre for Social Justice. She wrote the loveliest letter to me after I lost that job with Ian. And I saw in that letter from her a sort of a personal and caring dimension that I don't think the public have always seen with her. So although we really crossed swords during her time as Prime Minister, I wasn't her greatest fan, I still have a lot of admiration for her. And my first sort of piece of advice, and it's related actually to the article you've written in the Times today, Ian, about the sidelining of Parliament. But I'm just glad that she stayed in Parliament. Unlike David Cameron, unlike George Osborne or Gordon Brown or Tony Blair, she stayed in the House of Commons. And as a former Prime Minister, I think that matters. We need experienced voices on the backbenches. People perhaps who don't have anything now in their career to succumb to the whips, to calculate very carefully what they have to say, but just to bring their breadth of experience, their knowledge and their insight, and hold the government to account. We need more of that. So, well done for hanging on in there, Theresa, but carry on in there for the next few years as well. Don't give up your seat at the next election. It's good that you're there. I
think it's really important that, and it's this thing which has happened to British politics, where people think that they're somehow obliged to leave, or they have to leave because they want to make money, and maybe it is connected to money, but it's also, I think, they maybe feel some sense of embarrassment. It's a real mistake. I mean, if you think about it historically, it's just that's how you end up very often with leaders at the right moment in a crisis, with experience, because they have weathered the storms, maybe been fired or moved from one of the great offices of state. They know how the system works, and they should be, ideally, they're there on hand to use that expertise. Churchill's the best example, isn't he? Absolutely, imagine if Churchill had said, "That's it, I'm no longer Chancellor of the Exchequer. The gold standard business is all a bit embarrassing. I'm now off to go and write articles and paint pictures," which is what he did anyway, "but I'm going to resign my seat in a huff." He wouldn't have then been available to rejoin the government in 1939 and become Prime Minister in 1940.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want my second piece of advice?
Yep.
So the second piece of advice is, I'm here talking to you from sunny Salisbury, and it is a beautiful Salisbury today, and I'm just live a few footsteps out of the side of the Cathedral Close. And of course, one of the most famous residents of the Cathedral Close was the late Ted Heath. And of course, Ted Heath is probably more remembered for anything other than taking Britain into the European Union, which we won't talk about today, for the Great Sulk. His great sulk of his post-premiership life. He never came to terms with the fact that Margaret Thatcher replaced him as Tory leader. And really, he tried with Selsdon Man to do the kind of economic reforms that she succeeded in doing, but he couldn't. And for all sorts of reasons, he never forgave that woman. And I in Andrew Gimson's piece that you referred to at the beginning, Ian, he warns that she mustn't become a Ted Heath figure. And I actually think nearly all of the criticisms that she made of the current government, whether it's the nature of the travel ban, whether it's the cutting of the aid budget, whether it was the appointment of David Frost, who had no security experience at all, to the position of National Security Advisor, a thing that, of course, Boris Johnson eventually U-turned on. But I agreed, I think, with all of the criticisms that she's made, but she has to ration them. You know, a criticism or an intervention by a former prime minister should be an event. It shouldn't be something whereby, oh my goodness, Theresa May is attacking the government again. She needs to be sure that when she makes an intervention, it really counts. So my second piece of advice to her is really a counterweight to that first piece. Yeah, it's great to have her in the Commons speaking the truth, but be aware that your advice could have a half-life if you repeat it and you offer it too often.
That's good advice. Can I pose a quiz question?
Oh, you're turning the quiz table thing on me.
Quiz. Which and I'm actually wondering whether I know the answer. Asking the question: which Tory party conference was it that Ted Heath was on stage with Margaret Thatcher?
This was the one in the IKEA chairs, wasn't it? I think they were blue, and they couldn't even look at each other, could they?
They had to be stationed, sort of sitting behind each other, so they wouldn't have to look at each other when they arrived on stage or during the event. It was during the Hague years.
It was during the Hague years. It was
Bournemouth.
It was when I loved the conference when it was in Bournemouth, but it was early Blair years, and I don't think this story is legend, but in the green room before they went on stage, Margaret Thatcher, to her credit, went up to Ted Heath and tried to shake his hand and sort of reconcile. And forgive the Ted Heath impersonation because it's probably terrible, but Ted Heath paused and he clearly thought about, should he shake a hand, should he greet? And he said, no, it's been too long. And he just never could get over, you know, what he thought she had done to him. And yeah, but that was a period when ex-leaders, you sort of had, I mean, Thatcher caused problems for Major, Heath caused problems for Thatcher. It was a period when actually the former Tory leaders were generally a problem. In more recent times, I think Ian Duncan Smith, William Hague, Michael Howard have actually been helpful to their successors. But yeah, that was a period when that wasn't the case.
And I suppose with longevity, just life expectancy improving, leaders now have a half-life, an extra life, and they have to calibrate it quite carefully, or should do, if they're worried about their reputation. Of course, then we talk about David Cameron another time, but that's even more complicated when you're younger, and it's a much longer half-life. So next piece of advice.
So the next piece of advice is very much taken from actually my time with Ian Duncan Smith. On the night he lost the leadership, back in 2003, we went to his favorite restaurant in Kensington. And that night, you know, I think it was on the back of a menu, we started to draw up the plans to launch the Centre for Social Justice, which, you know, I think has become one of Britain's most influential think tanks. You know, it's the Centre for Social Justice that really formed the prototype for the universal credit reform, which has certainly worked during the pandemic, despite its teething problems in previous years. And partly because of the first two things, still being in public life that I've recommended to Mrs. May, not making too many criticisms, build, you know, a positive legacy. It may not be setting up a think tank in her case, but set up some sort of initiative that will give you, you know, will bring your wealth of experience to the benefit of the country and the party. And she's associated, I think, she did a lot to support Women to Win. She really helped, without introducing quotas, a great number of extra women into parliamentary life. She really believes in diversity. She was the person who was architect of the modern slavery law. She has experience of how government works. She could focus on civil service reform. but build something positive and institutional. You know, unlike some other ex-leaders, she's not focused on money, clearly. That doesn't motivate her in the way that it does others, although she's perfectly capable of commanding a £20,000, £30,000 fee for an after dinner or a speaker event. Build an institution. And I think she would be surprised that, you know, she's got an incredible work rate, and I think she'd do it really well.
She could build it. She could build a think tank on negotiating.
Maybe not.
Sorry, sorry.
We are trying to be constructive.
That's naughty of me. I'm not entering into the spirit.
You are not. Consider your hand slapped.
So, advice number 4.
So advice number 4 is hire someone on social media. Her tweets at the moment are a bit, well, you know, they've sort of almost been written like by a committee or something. They're very predictable. But she loves her fashion. She's interested in walking and holidays. I mentioned at the beginning, she actually does have a caring, you know, a caring streak. Yeah. Get someone alongside you. It may be a friend. It doesn't have to be a formal advisor, but just start revealing some of your personality on Twitter, social media. I think she gets a really hard deal by Conservatives as much as anyone at the moment. But the British people are incredibly forgiving when you're a bit self-deprecating, when you show some of your personality, some of your hinterland. She has that, but I don't think she's showing it at the moment in her interventions. And I think it will actually balance this danger of her looking like a Ted Heath figure. If she looks like that isn't her big obsession, critiquing the government, there are other things going on in her life. I think it will help aid what should be, you know, her restoration in the public square.
But you're right, Tim, in that the public are the British public tend to be, not always the case, but tend to be really, really forgiving, and people become much more popular once they stop being a party leader. You think of the career trajectory of William Hague. Losing the 2001 general election in that way is probably one of the best things that ever happened to him. You look what he's built
absolutely afterwards
and after politics, and he's but still, I think that politics and Parliament in those terrible Brexit years, in the years after the referendum, all those years of constitutional turmoil, Parliament and the Commons would have been stronger, and history might have been slightly different if you had speaking from the backbenches, or maybe even in the government, William Hague, Gordon Brown on the Labour side, and Tony Blair. But of course they weren't there. I had one question for you, Tim, or do you have? Is that?
No, I've got one final one. It's almost like, I don't know whether I should have stopped at 4. Maybe this one is a weaker one, but actually I think it's important. I'm slightly nervous about it because maybe it's more personal, and perhaps I shouldn't stray into this territory. But I wonder how many people, after the experience she went through as Prime Minister, I don't know whether we're allowed to use this word on reaction podcasts, Ian, but she had quite a few bastards around her at various times who did not treat her particularly well, and that maybe has not helped her with, she probably regards me in that camp in some respects, but have a few candid, don't take notice of what people say about you on Twitter, don't take notice of what pundits say, but have a few candid friends around you who'll give you advice. And from some of the things I hear, I wonder whether how many people like that she's allowed into her life. And I think all of us need those candid friends. And I wonder whether she needs to more consciously groom that circle. Perhaps she's got it and I'm just being ignorant of it, which is why I slightly hesitate to have made the recommendation, but we all need it. All of us do.
You reminded me of something you said earlier, Tim, that before that general election disaster, and I think I was one of the people that said that she really should hold a general election, but I don't think anyone said hold a general election and run such an appalling campaign with several disasters right at the heart of it. She was very popular, and she had a real connection that those who conduct focus groups and opinion pollsters would tell you was real, and it was to do with her being regarded as the grown up in the room after the Boris Gove meltdown and Farage and the shenanigans of 2016. She was seen as the mature figure who would sort things out. Why do you think, the question I was going to ask you is, in terms of her legacy, why did she turn out to not be a good Tory party leader, really, by any measure? Because she had always been, I remember talking to her, rather stilted conversation at, I think it was a Con Home anniversary dinner where you had lots of MPs there and lots of journalists, and she was one of the guests, and she seemed to have the makings of really quite sort of canny prime minister. She had the measure of her male colleagues. She ran a long campaign wanting that job, but just positioning herself perfectly, and then it went wrong. What's happened? Is it all to do with that general election, or is there something deeper at work that meant that she wasn't made to lead?
Well, we could have an hour on this, I should think, but I definitely think the general election defeat was huge. Once she'd lost to Commons majority, her whole ability to negotiate was tricky. She had the whole reliance on the DUP. Every single Tory MP's vote mattered, and they could hold her to ransom. And we had all those difficult journeys across the English Channel where she agreed something with the European Union, but she couldn't get them past the House of Commons, and it was a nightmare. But it was actually, for those who haven't watched it, the conversation I had on YouTube for reaction with David Gauke yesterday, which people should visit. Both of us, and this is not Theresa May's fault, but both of us have sort of come to the conclusion that there was something that made the whole Brexit process a lot harder by having a Remainer rather than a Leaver in charge. I think a Leaver would have been able to compromise more because they would have had the credentials to tell Brexiteers, you can trust me. And I think there was always an element with Theresa May where she overcompensated for having backed Remain. And you had things like Amber Rudd's famous, when she was, Amber Rudd's a great person, but when she was Home Secretary, she had to, do you remember that registration scheme for immigrants? And it was a Remainer trying to understand the Brexit mentality and not quite getting it right. And I think we saw that again and again. And I think there should have been more compromise on negotiations. It should have been a more evolutionary process. I don't want to revisit my conversation completely with in the Gauke video, but just generally, there was a lack of warmth towards Europe as well. I think a Brexiteer would have been able to make a declaration of love to Europe in a way and say, we're leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving European civilization. But we had an antagonistic relationship with Europe throughout that negotiating period, and it made negotiations a lot harder. And I think that's the fundamental thing. She may have been a very good prime minister now during the pandemic. It may have been much more suited to her skills, but for the Brexit negotiations, I don't think she quite worked.
Yeah, it was that summer immediately after the turmoil of the referendum and Gove v Johnson, that once she became leader, she had to establish and prove her Brexit credentials because they were essentially non-existent. She had campaigned for Remain, and it's at that point where, and I certainly made that mistake. I assumed that some kind of compromise position would emerge, but that was shut down by May and her team that summer, and the speech that September, I think, which really created the red lines, and then she had very little room for manoeuvre once the election disaster happened. But I think it's, to be positive, I think you're absolutely right to alight on the fact that it's a very good thing that a former leader of the Tory party and a former prime minister has decided to stick with politics and make her voice heard and be a powerful presence in the House of Commons. So I think that's really very good advice, Tim. We're going to wrap up things there. If you're not a Reaction subscriber on YouTube, click the subscribe button. Please like our video as well. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on our site and you want to read my weekly newsletter and all of the journalism from the Reaction team, just visit the site, and it's really easy to become a subscriber and come to our first live event. Tickets are on sale. There are a few tickets left for my conversation with Neil Ferguson, the historian, about his book Doom, about the politics of the crisis and politics of crisis in general. And we'll be talking about much more than that as well. The state of the world, Biden, geopolitics, China, many other things. So if you can come along to that, it'd be great to see you there. Until next time, thank you very much.